So, where does Latin come from? It's part of a language family that has several others that are in relation to it. And it actually comes from an area around Italy, which is why most of us probably associate Latin with the Romans, as we should, and they are the people who would speak Latin. And Latin has been around for thousands of years. It's actually just about as old as Greek is, although Greek has continued on in a way that Latin has in a slightly different way, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Latin, as I mentioned, comes from Italy, and the main people who spoke it were the Romans originally. And the Roman Empire was an empire where dozens and dozens of languages were spoken. Greek was one of the more common languages that was spoken, and then eventually over time, Latin became the more dominant language of the two, and depending on the time period, depending on the region, Latin was spoken more or less. So let's just go to Rome, let's say at the turn of the century. So we're looking at the first century. This is roughly 2,000 years ago. Was Latin spoken? Absolutely. Of course it was spoken, and it had been spoken for hundreds of years there. At the same time, there were plenty of other languages that were being spoken. So the Apostle Paul, who was a very famous early Christian, when he decided to write a letter to the Christians who were living in Rome, he actually didn't write it in Latin, he chose to write it in Greek. And because Greek was a language that was spoken, but most importantly, because the people that he was writing to were immigrants, they were foreigners. So Greek was the language that was more common to them, and they probably didn't even know Latin, or if they did, they would have been more familiar with Greek. At the same time, if you're in other parts of the world, you would have heard Latin, and it was a language that if you really wanted to get by in the Roman Empire, it would be very helpful to know. So I had mentioned that Greek and Latin had coexisted, so they were both spoken at the same time. They've been spoken for thousands of years. If you go to Greece today, then Greek is still spoken. But if you go to Italy, for instance, Italian is spoken instead of Latin. And some people say, well, Latin is dead then. Well, no, absolutely. First of all, Latin has never died, but the very fact that you go to Western Europe and most all of the languages there are essentially Latin that's been slightly changed over time, then you see how successful Latin is, and in fact that it's still very much alive. But if you go to France, or you go to North Africa that speaks French, or you go to many other places in the world where these Romance languages are still spoken, if you think about it, it's essentially Latin that's just evolved over time. So Latin has existed for thousands of years. It was really the common language in the Roman Empire, and it was the official language of the Roman Empire. And we should expect in Rome it's going to radiate out from that direction, and it does all throughout Europe and other parts of the world. And those languages in the West, where the Romans kind of went up a little north, but mostly west and a little south, we see that those turned into Spanish, and they turned into Italian, they turned into Catalan and Romanian and so forth. And these are simply Romance languages that are coming from Latin. They're Latin just a little farther removed down the family tree. But they're Latin nonetheless, they at least come from Latin,